Welcome back. Previously, we were discussing about the post-independence phase of cooperative movement in Africa. Let us discuss about the further phases during the development of cooperative movement in Africa. Previously, we mentioned about the different phases which the cooperative movement has to go through during the post-independence cooperation, and in general, we can say that because of the implementation of various SAPs and democratic reforms and various political conditions, the entire structure of activity of the cooperatives of the Africa has changed. And apart from that, the cooperative movement has to face some crisis. So those crises were termed as tight triple crisis. Tight triple crisis means, simple meaning means, the three crises that were mainly faced by the cooperative movement in Africa during the post-independence period. First one, identity crisis. Identity crisis means how a cooperative system can be formed. The cooperatives happens to stay so only by norms and not at all by nature. Previously, the cooperatives were formed on the base of the nature. Nature means if it is an agriculture-based form, it will be an agricultural cooperative. If it is for supporting the local people or consumers, it will be a consumer cooperative society, and likewise. But from now on, the cooperative have to stay only by norms. Norms means as per the rules, regulations, likewise, not on the base of nature. So that was the first crisis that were faced by the cooperative movement during the post-independence phase. Next one, environmental crisis. Environmental crisis in the sense means legal, political and circumstances situation. Means environmental crisis usually includes external factors with regard to the operations of a cooperative movement. The legal, institutional and administrative context created by the circumstances prevailing prevented instead of supporting the emergence of genuine self-managed cooperatives. The prevailing legal and political situations prevented the emergence of self-managed cooperatives. Usually the cooperative movement in Africa is a state-sponsored cooperative. In simple words, it means state-run or state-operated cooperatives. State-run or state-operated means state government. That is the meaning. Usually there will be a ruling party in the particular country, and that government will be the one who is running the cooperatives. So the environmental crisis mentioned that the legal political situations led to the prevention of the emergence of self-managed cooperatives. Self-managed cooperatives is just the opposite of government-run cooperatives. And finally, management crisis. The existing cooperatives could not survive after the withdrawal of subsidies, state protection and government control. As we have mentioned previously, we have mentioned that because of the implementation of SAPs, democratic reforms and political conditions, the involvement of government controlled cooperatives was removed. See, cooperatives lost protection and support, and members were aware of democratic rights. Lost protection and support means in the form of subsidies and other protection from the government. So that were the another crisis that were faced by the cooperative movements during the post-independent cooperatives. Next, we will be discussing about the emergence of fourth generation cooperatives in Africa. Previously, we have mentioned about the crisis that were faced by the cooperative movement in Africa, and the prevailing conditions led to the decline of state-sponsored cooperatives. But the situation of declining in the state-sponsored cooperatives led to the emergence of a new generation of cooperatives, otherwise known as fourth generation of cooperatives. Usually such cooperatives are genuine, member-owned and economically viable ventures were implemented. And the situation discussed, which we have discussed now, led to the replacement of agricultural cooperatives with savings and credit cooperatives. Next, we will be discussing about the various non-traditional types of cooperatives. Non-traditional type of cooperative means usually cooperatives may be concentrated on agriculture or a consumer cooperatives or dairy cooperatives, which we have learned previously. In non-traditional types of cooperative means areas that were not used in the field of cooperation. That is known as non-traditional cooperation. We will discuss about various areas that were coming under non-traditional types of cooperatives. The gradual extensions of unified cooperatives which were implemented by the British paved the way for a non-traditional cooperatives. And some of the examples of non-traditional cooperatives means cooperatives that were implemented in various areas such as housing, handicraft, cultural movements, transport, mining, social service and informal sector association. Apart from that, there are a number of examples of non-traditional types of cooperatives. Non-traditional type of cooperative means cooperatives movements that were usually followed a system. Usually followed system means usually a cooperative movement will be a consumer cooperative or it will be an agricultural cooperative or a dairy cooperative. Likewise, any cooperative that is running apart from these mentioned areas is known as non-traditional type of cooperatives. So the removal of a unified cooperative system that were implemented by the British led to the implementation of non-traditional types of cooperatives. That's how a non-traditional types of cooperatives run or implemented in Africa. So at present in Africa there exists a fusion means a club of traditional and modern as well as formal and informal system. Now the Africa is using the cooperative system that were including the principles and concept of traditional methods as well as modern method, and at the same time formal systems as well as informal system. And usually these present cooperatives in Africa are free from state control. Earlier we have mentioned that most of the cooperatives were state controlled or state sponsored. Implementation of SAPs and democratic reforms led to the decline in the state controlled cooperatives. So let us discuss some of the various types of cooperatives that were implemented in different parts of the countries. In countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, Namibia and Zimbabwe has shown a rapid expansion of financial cooperatives compared to the agricultural cooperatives that were running in the same countries. And other countries like Egypt, Kenya and Morocco were focusing on housing cooperatives rather than agriculture and other non-traditional types of cooperatives. Even though these countries will be having other cooperatives, but they may basically concentrate on these different types of cooperatives. And we all know fisheries cooperation department in India or especially in Kerala, it is known as Matsifed. Fisheries cooperatives in Africa are abundantly in various African countries. It is almost prevalent in almost all the African countries. In 2012, around 17 mutual cooperative insurance companies were active in 6 African countries, that were Algeria, Kenya, Morocco, Nigeria, South Africa, Tunisia. Africa is a large continent comprising of different countries. Almost all the countries are still in underdeveloped or developing countries, and many of the countries were suffering from various issues pertaining to the conditions prevailing in that country. Anyway, let's come back to our topic. So, in the 2012 survey, it is shown that 17 mutual cooperative insurance companies were active in 6 countries. So as part of your activity, try to identify the present condition of cooperative insurance companies in various African countries. Identify the various cooperative number of cooperative companies that is running in present scenario. Try to identify that and note it down. Next one, cooperative environmental factors. So from the environmental factors, you may think that it may be due to the environment with regard to the environment. So it doesn't mean like that. Cooperative environment factors basically external factors with regard to the operations of cooperative movement. So the system of cooperative has its own environment and ingredients. Cooperative environment consists of those facts that create, provide and maintain the atmosphere of formation, functioning, management and existence of cooperative in a society. So as part of an activity or a homework, try to identify the various cooperative environmental factors. There are many factors with regard to the operations of cooperation, but for the activity oriented point of view, I'll be giving some areas. Try to identify various environmental factors and mainly on cooperative legislation, promotional policies, and some of the external factors. Try to identify that and consider it as an activity. Next area, donor policies. You have heard about the term donor. Donor means donating something. Cooperatives in Africa had received substantial technical and financial assistance from multilateral and bilateral donors. Donors means someone who is donating something, and African cooperatives were getting some substantial amount of financial as well as technical assistance. This was mainly for cooperatives in agricultural sectors. These projects forwarded by the donors were driven by the main following objectives. These are the objectives that led to the assistance provided by various donors. First one, building and developing cooperatives as agents of change. The donors treated cooperatives in a way for farmers to free themselves from exploitation of capitalists and middlemen and to build up a socialist society. But this concern put an end to the cooperative development and paved the way for the formation of state-controlled cooperatives. And second objective was turn cooperatives into instruments to boost production. The rural development projects and individual farmers were sought to connect to each other through cooperatives by distributing input through extension services and rural credit systems. And the donors provided financial assistance as well as technical assistance to consider the cooperative as an instrument to boost production. The objective was by boosting production, the employment of the farmers or the lower section of the people will increase. By providing employment, the standard of living will be increasing, which leads to the increase in the economic development of the country. That was the objective of the donor. But the thing is that it did not went as planned, because the concept is that the cooperatives cannot be provide such assistance for developing the condition of the people. It is the duty of the cooperative to evolve within for protecting the weaker section of the society. By providing assistance to the cooperative doesn't mean that it will improve the condition of the people. It is the cooperative itself has to evolve. So the donor policy, even though it provided sufficient assistance to the cooperatives, it didn't went as per the plan. So let us go to the cooperative development and employment promotion. We have learned that through donor policies, these are the objectives, but these objectives were not fully achieved. And cooperative development and employment promotion. The development of cooperative, and through those development of cooperatives, employment can be promoted by providing employment standard of living can be increased, thereby increase the economic situation of the society. That was the ultimate objective. Let's see what was the actual situation. Both government and donors tried to develop cooperatives as a means to improve the living standards of rural population by way of increased production. Because we have learned here the objectives regarding that. The government and donors were planning something, but the thing is that the cooperatives were considered as a social political organization rather than employment creation. Because the cooperative movement in Africa were considered as a social political organization, means providing assistance to the weaker section, but they were not considered as an employment creation. And the government and cooperative departments were under the agriculture or rural development schemes, and because of that they were not interested in employment promotion. They were mainly concentrated in providing assistance to the weaker section, but not interested in providing employment to the weaker section. That was the difference. Next one, institutions, structures and support services. Institution structures and support services means with regard to the cooperative movement in Africa. So before we going further into that, first of all let us go to what was the legal framework that was prevailing in the African cooperatives. So under this section we will be discussing about what were the various institutions and what were the different framework and structures and various support services within the cooperatives for the overall development of the country as well as the overall welfare of the people. So first of all, from the legal point of view, what was the condition of the cooperatives in Africa? Most of the African countries adopted a single act for all types of cooperatives. Previously we have mentioned that in Africa is a continent consisting of different countries. Different countries follow different types of cooperatives. So the thing is that each cooperative has a different style of operation. For operating in different style they need a different act or a law. But the thing is that most of the African countries adopted a single act. And the thing is that act is a age-old act, means that act may be implemented by the colonial people, and the thing is that colonial people or the colonial persons, they will implement laws in a colonial country. The thing is that those laws will ultimately protect colonial people. So that acts were not perfect, and most of the African countries were following those acts implemented by the colonial people. So that was one of the issues. Some of the countries adopted separate laws for separate sectors. Some of the countries means some of the socialist countries. We have mentioned about socialist countries in the previous sessions. Go through that area. What were the socialist countries in Africa? Such countries adopted separate laws for separate sector. Separate means one law for housing sector, housing cooperative society, another law for agriculture cooperative society, separate law for fisheries cooperative society. It will be good from that point of view. The thing is that again these laws were ultimately supporting the ruling party. Ruling party means there will be a party that will be controlling the government of that particular country, and those laws were ultimately favoring the ruling party. The thing is that again the cooperation will be the under control of the government rather than the people, because cooperation is working on a democratic system. Then how can we provide the control to a government? Next one, SAPs. We have mentioned about SAPs previously. SAPs and democratic reforms led to the implementation of liberal political neutral laws. Only through these reforms during the later part of the 20th century that led to the implementation of liberal and political neutral laws. And until now, some of the new liberal and political neutral laws are still in operation in various cooperative movements in Africa. And finally, some legislations were implemented for maintaining the monopoly of various cooperatives. Monopoly of the various cooperatives means in order to protect the poor sections of the people, there should be a monopoly in the field of cooperation, because if there is private parties or many competitors other than the cooperatives, definitely that private parties or other concerns will overcome the cooperation or cooperative movement, because cooperative movement is working on protecting the people, but private section or other sectors other than cooperatives were running with some other objective. So in order to protect the cooperation from that competition, some sort of monopoly should be given, and some legislation were implemented in providing monopoly to the cooperatives. So these were the legal framework that were happening or that were in operation in African countries. We will be discussing about other sections in the next session.